Hi everybody and welcome. I'm Rick Walton, and yes, I've got very dodgy shades on, and yes, the sun's gone in, so I don't probably even need them, but whatever. And I'm going to talk a book again, if I might, just for the lols. The book, however, is not lol-tastic, actually. It's this. Many of you will have seen or heard of it or whatever. Rutger Bregman, Humankind. Um, really interesting, and hell of a challenge to try and grab hold of the essence of, but I'm going to try and do that a bit. And it's, again, as always, just a way into a discussion about it, just about some ideas. I don't think I'm some kind of god-given genius and literary um, intellectual necessarily. I'm just some bloke who's interested in this stuff, who thinks, yeah, okay, I'm going to talk about it and just see what happens. Okay, right. So deep breath, because of all the books that I've read in the last period, and there have been a few actually, this is a really tough one to kind of encapsulate. So again, I've cheated. I've got some notes here, okay? And forgive me if at some stage I'll read some of those. In a nutshell, this book, Rutger Bregman, Humankind, is a corrective to cynicism, bad or malicious science, history, and received wisdom. It's an interesting and profound challenge to so many of the assumptions we make about us as people. The scope of it is kind of sensational. So it's crazy ambitious, and all the better for it, actually, and very refreshing for that. And it's, yeah, very car coming past, which is unhelpful but not terminal, right? What's the word I'm looking for? Well, it's let's try and find it. Let's try and find it, okay? Um, so in particular, what the author is looking to do is unpick our view, the relatively all-pervasive view, he would argue, I think, of us humans now as more or less Machiavellian, Hobbesian. So, in other words, we ain't all that good. We are, if not programmed to be evil and tribal, we're of that ilk rather than the opposite. And there is much research, and if you listen to much of the news, it kind of would persuade you of this kind of Machiavellian view of how we are. Bregman absolutely seeks to argue against that, and I'm with him on that in many respects. So to give you he gives us examples. He tries to make it a kind of scientifically argued premise that, hang on, we're better than this. Why are we thinking? Why do we imagine that we are like this? And he goes through history. I mean, the ambition is crazy. Picking out many things, including, just as a fairly abstract example, uh, you know, I half remember students in America, I'm fairly certain, being put through a test, an allegedly scientific psychological test, whereby one group were asked to be the jailers of another group, and in theory it was a neutral kind of test to establish what human behaviour was all about, what behaviours would occur if these students, the jailers, let's say, if it was down to them how they treated the students on the receiving end. And I do remember some things from my youth. It's a very famous experiment. He goes into that in some detail, as well as others. In that particular case, he absolutely unpicks it as a fraud, basically, and goes on to do the same with many similar arguments that work on the assumption that, or even more cynically, work towards proving that people ain't good. We just aren't. And there are masses of examples, some big, some small. I'll come back to more in a minute. So, and he goes on to expand upon this argument via falsified or misleading diktats or approaches or policy from politicians of all kind of spheres all over the world, and generals and military people who are absolutely raging certain that people will do bad unto other people and that we can make that work for us. So Bregman, yeah, individually, sorry, I'm being rather general, but there are so many examples, it's hard to pick through these. In general terms, he argues, indeed, he would say the evidences, and that's really important. It's not a general waffle, this. He does try to be very scientific, for want of a better word, in seeking out, as with everybody, okay, maybe one of the weaknesses of this book, perhaps, is that it would likely be the case that Bregman has his conclusion first and works towards it. I think he would argue against that, but I think his own, the expanse of this book proves very much that much of key psychological research, maybe in particular, but not just that field, suffers from not being neutral, not actually being genuinely scientific, not being fair. People have done stuff, done experiments with a view to prove X or Y, and that's an important kind of fulcrum of the book. Now then, so his conclusions, which he draws from research about research, actually, probably in many cases, is very much that people are not, and people are provably not innately bad or evil or Machiavellian or Hobbesian, although it can happen. It is true to say, and he will accept this, he does explicitly, that people probably feel more comfortable with their own sort, for want of a better phrase. However, we are not necessarily tribal in a negative, nasty, warmongering-like way with other folks. And he has masses of evidence for that argument. So it runs against the thread, the grain of the cynicism of the world, which is all around us, comes from the news, comes from politicians, comes from every direction, which has a particular momentum behind it, a particular axe to grind. So, in that way, it's a very optimistic book. It's called the subtitle is A Hopeful History. It is very hopeful in that way. He ploughs through a significant number of examples. Again, off the top of my head, prisons in Norway would be another one. Prisons in Norway have been, or there has been an approach where the idea that this needs to be punitive, essentially, has been slung out the window. It's much more about genuine rehabilitations, because it's surely, we should know, we do know, the facts are there everywhere, that prisons don't work. They just do not work in terms of rehabilitating prisoners. The States is the greatest example of this. Shocking numbers of people in prison. Many of them, the percentages of reoffenders are appalling, because the whole environment actually encourages more offence, literally. In Norway, there is another approach which is massively more enlightened. And yes, in the short term, it's more expensive, inevitably maybe, providing all kinds of stuff and services for the prisoners in order to make them feel and act human. But in the medium and longer term, it saves the government masses of money, because the numbers of reoffending are massively lower. An interesting one, and again, it's about showing a kind of generosity of spirit in a way, or a liberal, we've got to be careful with that one, I get that, but a liberal view of how we might improve things, but ambitious, really ambitious. Another example is in his Dutch, from in Holland. There is a particular company that he quotes, which is, some would say, kind of ludicrously anarchic. It's not, actually. They just let the individual members, it's a kind of cooperative plus, it's in healthcare. They've absolutely thrown it over to the employees. There is no real hierarchy, and shock, horror, probe, people meet, they are really, really professional. They provide better service, better value service. It's being recognised. There's been a huge growth in that particular company because people's trust in each other and their willingness to cooperate has absolutely blown the competition out of the water. I mean, that's a surreal kind of comparison, given that the whole premise is kind of anti-capitalist, but actually that's what it has done. That kind of generosity of spirit has changed things massively. There's a really fascinating one about terrorism in Colombia, similar kind of but different. Look, I don't want to go through the whole list of these. It's not going to sound good or be entertaining. Read the book. It is eye-opening, certainly, probably more than that. There are huge themes, huge, bold, generous challenges, about essentially, do we trust, do we believe in people, do we have faith in them? And the author, in short, says yes, we must, and the proof is there. And he's gathered the evidence, he would say. I think many will find this a really uplifting book, really uplifting, possibly even life-changing. It's got that kind of scope. Inevitably, maybe those on the right of the political, philosophical spectrum will probably deride it, probably think it's lefty cobblers, as we would say over here. But I'm not with them at all. I'm not with them at all. I strongly recommend that whatever your political viewpoints, you read the book. What it does is demystify, for all of us, whatever your bent, it does demystify so many of the myths about incarceration, about people's alleged innate violence and what we're likely to be. So therefore it really is important. And for many of us, I think, wonderfully energizing. Personally, I am still trying to work out if I'm completely convinced by all the arguments. Possibly not, but I don't want that to sound negative. I think that's inevitable, given that the scope of this book is so massive, awesome. Why wouldn't there be loopholes in it? I can live with that, absolutely. I think it's enormously profound, and because of that gargantuan scope, it's inevitably, surely, how could it be inviolably right about everything? He wouldn't pretend that that it could be. So read it. Just read it. I'm going to finish up with a very short quote. This is a book about a radical idea that most people, deep down, are pretty decent. That's the argument. I support it very much. Read it and come back to me, by all means.